All right. I'm actually impressed with how many people showed up for this, so thank you. That's cool. So today I'm going to be talking about extending modern editors with PowerShell. And the subtitle of this is One Module to Extend Them All. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm David Wilson. I'm a member of the PowerShell team. And my job day to day is to work on the PowerShell development experience in terms of editors. So like the PowerShell ISE, PowerShell ISE Preview. I also created the PowerShell extension for Visual Studio Code and PowerShell Editor Services, and I co-maintain those with Keith Hill. So that's been pretty cool for the last 6 months. So the agenda for today is a little bit to sort of discuss the vision and goals for what I'm trying to accomplish here, and give some API demonstrations for the new extensibility model that I'm trying to create. Have a little bit of a discussion about how it works, and then just sort of open it up for just general discussion, sort of get your feedback and ideas, and see what things people might want to do with this. So as far as the vision is concerned, last year, I think in November, I tried to do a hackathon for PowerShell Editor Services and the different editors that it could possibly be integrated with. And for those of you who don't know what PowerShell Editor Services is, it's basically a new library or platform, I don't really know what to call it. It's a language server that makes it possible for PowerShell development experience to be added to pretty much any editor that has a sufficiently extensible API. So for instance, Visual Studio Code, Sublime Text, Atom, Emacs, Vim, anything that you can sort of write new behavior into could potentially use this platform. So I had a hackathon for editor services, and a lot of people seem to be interested in contributing, but it turns out that the PowerShell community is mostly focused around PowerShell, so it was sort of difficult to get contributions to the C# code base that I've created for editor services, and also the TypeScript code base for VS Code, and Python code base for Sublime Text, etc. So I started thinking about how I could enable the PowerShell community to contribute to the PowerShell editing experience using PowerShell. The other thing is it would be nice to leverage existing community work as new editor features. So there's all sorts of code that's out on the PowerShell gallery. There's all sorts of code and blogs, all sorts of stuff that do interesting things. And a lot of this could easily be turned into features in an editor. For instance, someone may have written some sort of code formatting module or some kind of thing that generates code or anything like that that might actually be something that could be useful in the context of an editor. So it would be cool to be able to use this existing stuff to add new functionality. And another part of the vision is to be able to write one piece of PowerShell code and use it ideally everywhere. So not having to write special casing code for different editors, but just have like one model that can potentially add new behavior in all these places. And for those of you who might be already aware of the PowerShell ISE's extensibility model, you can think of it as like the $PS ISE, but generalized to be sort of general editing concepts rather than just something specific to one editor's implementation. So the overall goals are to provide a standard API for all editors. And this really encompasses the general things that you would want to do in an editor, like editing text, or managing files, or the workspace, like opening files, closing files, saving files, creating files, those kind of things. And also registering commands. So in many editors, you have the ability to add new commands through extensions. It would be nice if PowerShell could actually cause commands to be registered in an editor so that they're accessible to the user. Also, to be able to provide editor-specific API enhancements for the editors who have their own sort of rich extensibility API. So it would be nice if the PowerShell extensibility model could actually give you access to the specific APIs for like VS Code, for instance, to be able to access some of their UI integrations, or maybe in the PowerShell ISE, being able to use the existing sort of UI plugin model, but maybe reformulate it so that it follows a new design better. And one sort of crazy goal that may or may not happen, but is sort of interesting to think about, is that you could potentially use this extensibility API to write your own extensions for various editors without it actually being attached to the PowerShell extension for those editors. You could actually use PowerShell editor services to ship an extension that has just a very minimal amount of code to wire it up to the editor and then write all of your actual extension logic in PowerShell. So if you had some idea to extend VS Code and you don't want to learn TypeScript or VS Code's APIs, you could potentially use this Extensibility API and PowerShell editor services to ship an extension. But that may or may not be such a good idea, so I'm not really advocating it, but I know certain people are interested in it. Yes? PowerShell for email. Oh, yeah. Well, that's going to happen at some point, because I want it to happen, so it'll happen. So I'm going to go ahead and just get right into demos, because there's no point in actually just talking more about this. But before I do that, I would like to sort of give you a little bit of context and information. First of all, the API is still pretty rough. For this presentation, I invented a new development paradigm called presentation-driven development. And what I did was I had an idea, and I proposed a presentation. And then 2 weeks before the presentation, I said, oh, shit, and then had to implement all the features. So I was literally developing it up until this morning.
Do you have Linux and the Mono framework in view?
Well, PowerShell doesn't run on Linux, so the only way to make this happen is through some network connection stuff that may or may not happen later. I'm still trying to figure out how to make that happen, but it's possible. I mean, theoretically, it's possible to have an editor running in Linux connected to a language server that's running in a Windows VM and be able to get PowerShell capabilities there. So it's something I'm trying to think about how to make happen, so it might be possible. So yeah, the API is still pretty rough, and because of that, I would say just ask questions anytime. I mean, if something doesn't make sense to you, or if you have an idea for how something can be done, or I don't know, for any reason, just ask a question. It's totally cool. Give feedback on anything. So if maybe the naming of a function or the way that something is set up is not really clear, definitely tell me, because I want to try to, part of the reason for doing this presentation is to get feedback on the model before I get too deep into it. So it'd be good to get feedback on any kind of API shape issues.
What's the best way to get feedback? Connect to a user voice?
Well, GitHub probably would be the best for this, because this is for the open source PowerShell editor services project. So this is already on GitHub, has been for a while, yeah. Yeah, and it really just ideas for what else that can be added. So I've got some thoughts about what this could be used for, but it would be cool to know what other people think it might be used for, so that I can add more capabilities to the API for really cool integration scenarios. All right, so let's go directly into the demo. So I'm going to show you Visual Studio Code, because that was the easiest editor to get this hooked up for first. All right, let me zoom in on that a little bit. So the sort of top-level entry point to the API is this PS editor object. So this is a lot like PS ISE in the ISE. If you go into this object, you'll see that it has a couple of properties and some methods. One of the important things would be the version of editor services. Yes?
Can you switch to white background?
Yeah, sure.
It's hard to read. Thank you.
Is that better? Cool. All right. So to be able to know what the editor services version is running in the editor is helpful, because it sort of dictates what version of the API that you're going to be using. And in the very early days, this will be really important, because things may change drastically in the early versions of this stuff. So this is sort of a good place to look for knowing whether you're going to have compatibility for what you're trying to access. There's also access to the workspace. And I expected there would be a lot more properties like this that have sort of other API endpoints. But one example of this right now is the workspace section. And you'll have things like opening files, and later there'll be things like creating files, closing files, etc.
David, is it when you talked about knowing the version, is it your expectation that you'll have ongoing set of breaking changes?
No, actually.
Can you repeat the question? Because we all
Yes. So Kenneth asked if the expectation by having this version field is that there will be ongoing breaking changes. I think there may be some until we hit 1.0 for editor services. And my idea is to have to try to hone in on the API shape, not only for the extensibility model, but for everything in editor services for a 1.0 release sometime later this year, so that we can sort of like make it stable enough to people can build on it and have some expectations going forward. So this will be more important in the very beginning, just to maybe know that between version 0.6 and 0.7, maybe there's some things changed, like parameters changed, but eventually this is all going to stabilize, so it won't be as important. So yeah, like there'll be methods here for dealing with files, etc. I mean, it's pretty easy. You can see that there's a open file method that takes a string path, or sorry, a file path. Other things that could be here would be something like the sort of language intelligence features that editor services has, like being able to find definitions of symbols, or maybe if you have the location where the cursor is sitting, getting some information about what's there. Like, is it sitting on a symbol, like a variable or a function, or is it inside of the definition of a function? There's various different things that might be interesting for someone who wants to add capabilities to an editor that we could expose through like a language API set. There's also some potential for hooking into debugger events. The PowerShell APIs already provide a lot of this stuff, but there's some simplifications that can be done to make it a little easier for extension authors to leverage these things. So this sort of top-level object will give you access to the general capabilities of the Extensibility API. There's also this method called getEditorContext, and this may not be the best name for it, but it's sort of what I called it for now. But what it does is it gives you the current context of what the user is doing in the editor at any given time. So the file they have open, where the cursor position is, what text may be selected at that time. So it's kind of useful for doing things directly on the file that the user is editing. So actually, I can show you what kind of things you can get from that. So if I run this and start to mess around with this context object. Yeah, well, you sort of have one here. So actually, there's a common, I wouldn't call it a complaint, I would call it a request about the PowerShell extension for Visual Studio Code that there needs to be an interactive console. And yeah, I agree. I have to work this out with the Visual Studio Code team, but that work is actually currently in progress. I'm sort of having design discussions with them to figure out how to make a persistent REPL possible. But in the meantime, there actually is the functionality where you can select some code in your file and hit F8, and it will run it, and you'll see it in this output pane. So it sort of gets you part of the way there. It's a little bit lame, because if you want to like call it get child item, you have to actually type it into the buffer and then select it and run it. But it's good enough for doing things now until we get the actual console later. So in the context that I just pulled from the editor, I can see that we have access to the current file, cursor position, selected range. We can also do things like set the selection. And the concept here is that the context gives you information about the active editor pane. So anything that is relative to where the user is in the editor will be here in the context object. So for setting a selection, actually I have some code here. So I can set the selection from line 2, column 1, to line 10, column 1. So it would be from here to about here. So if I run this, it'll actually select the text. So that is useful for certain things, may not be useful for a lot of things, but it sort of shows you that it's possible to manipulate the editor in place. So you can get information about the current file, not only the file path, but you can get the AST, because we've already parsed the file, we have that information. Information about the size of the file, since a lot of the operations that we have in the API are based on ranges in the file. You also need the range of the entire file in case you want to do something like replace the entire text of the file or something. Let's see, that one is going to get removed. So getting the text from the file, so just any contents of the file. There's also a couple overloads here, so you can get text, just all the text, or you can get the text within a certain range. It's helpful for if you want to get the text where the user has a selection, so just want to deal with only what they've selected at the moment. That's pretty helpful. Also, inserting text. That also has a couple overloads where Insert text is kind of like a Swiss Army knife for manipulating text, because you can do any type of editing operation with an insert. So if you think about it, the most basic type of insert is just inserting text wherever the cursor currently is. So you can see that there's an insert text method that only takes a text string. So that will just put it wherever the user's cursor is. There's also insert text for a specific position. So if you just say, I want you to insert text at position line 1, column 10 or something, then you can tell it to do that. Then there's also inserting text for a specified range, which this is where it starts to become more powerful, because if you select a range and tell it to give, or you give it a piece of text that's longer than what was previously in that range, then you're basically replacing the text and actually adding more text to it. If you give less text, then you're sort of reducing the range. You're sort of shortening the file, basically. And if you give it an empty string, it's basically a deletion. So you can do pretty much any kind of editing operation with this overload of the method. Then there's the actual overload that takes a real range object, and that would come from the user's current selection or like the range for the entire file. So it just makes it easier to pass those objects already in. We also have information about the path and the tokens for the file. So more stuff can be added here. I haven't really thought through like what all needs to be added to this thing, but for now, this is pretty good for doing some basic extensibility work. Yes?
The methods in the context, editor context, can we make public so that other extension, other file types can make use of them?
Yeah.
It just strikes me that it's not specific to PowerShell.
Yeah. So that's the idea, is that this shouldn't be specific to PowerShell. I actually need to do a little bit of work in editor services, because right now it is a little bit PowerShell focused, but I want to generalize it so that you could pull in any type of file, like Markdown or text or some other language like Ruby or something. And then you could use the same API to manipulate those things. The only thing you would lose in that case is just like the AST and the tokens, because we can't tokenize other languages, but or at least not at the moment. Let's see, any other questions at the moment? I think that's everything for context. So you can use these APIs directly like this. You could make a script that actually calls these APIs and does something in the editor, but that's not really that helpful. I mean, it's just sort of like you run a script and it sort of automates things in the editor. Okay, it doesn't do much. The real way this should be used is to register new commands in the editor so that a user can actually see it in the command palette. So for those of you who haven't used editors like VS Code or Sublime Text or Atom before, there's this concept of a command palette. So if I hit Control-Shift-P, it brings up this list of commands, which is basically every possible command that the editor can do. So if I'm interested in doing things with files, I can type in the word file, and it filters it down to the list of commands that operate on files. This is a really powerful metaphor. What's that?
You ended fine.
Fine, yes. That's not what I meant, but okay. So it's really powerful because this surfaces everything in the editor in this one interface. And also for extensions, it actually makes it so that any extension can have their actions be at the same level as built-in actions in the editor. So everything is sort of on a level playing field. The idea with this model is that you would register a command that should show up in this top-level list, so that anyone who uses your module that has some extension commands can easily find it here. However, all of these editors who have this model currently sort of expect that these commands should be statically registered and they can't be dynamically registered. And that's a little bit of a shame, but I think that I should be able to find some way to generate the proper manifest for the extension so that if you reload the editor, that the commands from PowerShell should show up. And I've already got like an issue out to the VS Code team asking them to add this dynamic registration functionality, though I don't really see them responding to it, so I don't know if they're going to do it. But in the meantime, it's still possible to register new commands, and the way that I'm exposing them is through this. Is this show additional commands from PowerShell modules action? Good question.
So maybe you can tweet that issue and we can all...
Yeah, that's a great idea. So I'm going to tweet this issue, and then you also just bomb the VS Code team, and then they'll be like, okay, all right, we'll add it. I should do that more often. That's a great idea. So if I hit show additional commands from PowerShell modules, you'll see that there's actually nothing registered at the moment. That's on purpose, because we haven't actually done anything yet. So what we'll do is we'll check out this register editor command. This is your entry point into registering a new command with the editor. I'm using verbose here just so we can see some output, but you don't really need to use that. You provide it with a name, which is sort of a unique identifier for the command. And the idea is that someone who's writing a module that actually contains extension commands, you should namespace it so that it's unique to your module, unique to your functionality, because the idea is we're going to have a bunch, well, theoretically we'd have a bunch of commands registered in the editor, and we need to be able to uniquely identify them. Also, we have a display name, which is basically what you would see in the command palette. So whatever you want to display here is what you would add for the display name. Yeah. I did it for my own clarity here, but I know it's not a good thing to do. So also, you can either register a command with a script block or with the name of a function or a commandlet. Script block is kind of useful for just really quickly registering a command that does something. I see this as a way to invoke some kind of action that you may have that is like a common action, like maybe you're running a deployment script or a build script or just whatever that you might want to bind to a key binding, because one of the benefits of actually registering a command with the editor is you can bind a hotkey to the command. So if you have something you want to run constantly or run really conveniently, you could easily just kind of throw a command registration into your profile, and it will always be available whenever you use your editor. So I'm actually going to run this right now so we can see that it works. So I hit F8. You can see that a new command with a script block was registered. And if I open up the Show Additional Commands list, you'll see that there's a basic example command here now. So I'll press Enter to execute it. And you can see that my command script block was executed, so basically called write output. And that output went straight to the console. So pretty lame example, but we can go a little bit further. So for both the script block and the function registration for commands, there is a context object, the same context object you saw before, that gets passed into the script block or function that you registered with a command, so that you can actually do something based on the current context of the user whenever they actually run this command. So let's sort of give an example of what that looks like. So at first, we can do something like just write out the output of the file. I'm going to go ahead and just register all of this. And I'll run it. So I'll run my better example command. And you can see that it basically just spit out the whole file contents to the console. You can also grab the selected range. So unfortunately, I have to keep reevaluating this function. I need to add a hotkey for evaluate function. I think ISE steroids may have something like this already. All right, so I reevaluated the function, and now I'm going to go ahead and just select this line of text, or these lines of text, and run my better example command, and then you'll see that it has written out the selected text, and it actually didn't write out the indentation from the first line because I only selected that bit right at the comment, and it just wrote out that stuff. So if you actually select more of it, you'll just get more of it. So it's pretty clear what happens there. Also, inserting text. That's where things start to become interesting, because why would you want to write an editor extension unless you wanted to actually manipulate a file? So what I'm going to do here is insert text at line 35, column 1, and I'm going to insert multiple lines of text, basically. So you should see, strangely, that should be empty. Trying to make sure that it's going to end up in the right place. Let's just do that. All right, so the idea is to insert it at line 35, column 1. So I'll go ahead and reevaluate this function. And as you might notice, I don't have to re-register the command. The command's already registered, so I'm basically just reevaluating the same function in the session, which is kind of nice because it allows you to iteratively develop your extension without having to do a lot of weird stuff. So now it's re-registered. And line 35 is there, so I'll move the cursor away. Run this better command example. And now it inserted at line 36. Oh, no. there's a new line in what I inserted, so that makes sense. So basically, you can see that it inserted some PowerShell code there. Let me clean that up a little bit. So that's cool, but what if you want to replace some text? So if I uncomment these lines, you can see that I'm inserting text between lines 35 and 38 at the first column, and I'm replacing it with a string that basically is a comment that says overwritten. So let's go ahead and run this again. And let's keep an eye on this text because it should get replaced. Yeah, so it gets replaced with overwritten. I think my line choices are wrong at the moment because something changed at the top of the file. I think I had something like that here, so let's try that. Okay, so I've overwritten some text. That's cool. So what about deleting text? So I'm going to go and try to delete lines 35 to 37 by just inserting a white space. So if I go ahead and evaluate the function again, now I can launch the better example command. I should make that visible so it can be seen. And then the text goes away because it's been deleted. So you can do pretty much anything here. The idea is that you would probably do something based on some text that the user has selected, maybe replacing the text or maybe adding some new text somewhere else in the file. You could do something like some form of snippet or template-based creation of functions if you wanted to do something like that. Maybe there's some other things I haven't thought of yet. Another thing that's interesting to do is inserting text relative to the cursor position, because maybe you want to add something above the current line or at the end of the current line or at the beginning of the current line, anything like that. So let me actually simplify this a little bit first. So I can basically insert text right at the cursor position, and we can already sort of do that with the overload of this method that doesn't take a position, but let's just do this anyway just for the sake of curiosity. It seems I've lost my mouse cursor here. All right. So if I put my cursor right here, run the method, and basically just inserts text right there where it was. So that can be helpful in various cases. But it's better if we can do some kind of math for the cursor. So being able to say, move one line above or something like that. So I could say add offset, and this will basically allow me to add an offset to the current cursor position because I'm calling it from cursor position. Say maybe move it one line up, and don't move the column at all unless it's necessary. So let's go ahead and evaluate this code. All right, and I've got a couple lines here that are actually useful for showing some things about this. So I'm going to be right here in this line, and I'm going to tell it to insert the text at the line above at the same column location. So basically inserted it right there above. But what if the line that you're currently in is longer than the previous line that you're inserting in, but you're not really accounting for that in the offset? We should be able to handle that, right? So let's run this. So basically, it figures out that the line above is shorter than the current line where the current position is, and it is able to add it at the end of the line there. One other thing that's kind of interesting to mention is that these are actually edits happening in the editor and not on the file itself, so I can actually undo and redo these things. So this actually becomes part of the editing history. Let's see. There's another thing we can do. We can say add offset -1, and these calculations can be chained together. So add offset returns a position. From there, I can do something else like get line start. So I can say go up one line and add text at the beginning of that line. So if I go ahead and reevaluate this, I can go here and insert at the line above at the very beginning of the line. And we consider the start of the line where the text actually starts. So we basically skip any indentation and then use the actual beginning of the line. And it may be, well, I guess if you wanted to start it at the beginning of the line, there may be an easier way to do that, but I like the literal beginning of the line, but may not matter that much. So also, it's interesting to see whether it works with indentation on lines that don't have the same indentation level. So if I run it like this, and I'm doing it from some short line to some indented line, it basically inserts it at the right indentation level for that line. All right, so that's basically what this is capable of right now for file edits. Not very interesting. I mean, yeah, I guess this doesn't really show you how you could write an extension to do something useful and then ship it as a module. So I've got another example that can show you that.
Quick question before.
Yeah.
If I do an offset minus one row, I would suspect that it would insert like that position, so it would fill the row with spaces. And if I want the end of the line, I would do like offset minus one row dot end of line.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point actually. Maybe I can add like a parameter for like actually padding if there isn't enough length in the previous line to be able to do that. So yeah, that's certainly valid.
Then it would work like the multi-cursor selected, like in ISE.
Right.
Maybe I want like a block of comments to the right of my code.
That makes sense.
Them aligned.
Yeah. So Simon basically is saying that he would like it if the insertion relative to the end of a line, if you have an offset that moves you up one line, if the line above is not long enough, there should be an option to be able to pad that line to actually make it long enough to have the position that the offset should actually land at. So it's good for things like multi-line comments that are at the end of lines or something like that you want to keep aligned or insert in a way that's aligned. So yeah, that definitely makes sense. So I've got this example editor command module that I've got some stuff in. And what I'm doing is sort of making good on this concept of reusing existing PowerShell community code. So I'm using this format PowerShell code module that is currently posted to the PowerShell gallery, made by a guy named Zach Lober, I think. I don't know if he's here at this at the summit or not. I don't know where he is. But anyway, he basically made a module that is capable of formatting PowerShell code using some sort of different, I don't know, you could call them best practices. I don't know, maybe they're just his own personal preferences. So he has a set of functions that you can call to basically pipe your text through to do various different formatting actions. So I'm going to use these to provide a code formatting command in a file, or for any file. So you can see that I've got this invoke format file command, and it takes an editor context, and it's basically building an updated text string using the current text of the file, like the entire text from the current file, then pipes it through all these formatting methods, and then ultimately inserts it back into the file, or the updated text back into the file using the whole range of the file. So it basically replaces the entire file. And one thing that is useful if you want to ship a module that has some generally useful functionality, but may also want to register commands in an editor, is you would look for in your PSM1 file this whether this PS editor object actually exists, and then if it does, then call the register editor commandlets so that you can allow the user to import this module in the normal PowerShell console and have it be useful, but then also give extra functionality if it's used within an editor. So that's basically the model that I'm using here. So I'm going to go ahead and just run this. And I've got a handy little file that is obfuscated that we can use. So that was not right. Let's see. So I'm going to go run my format PowerShell script command. And now this is going to go run that formatter function and then spit back out the formatted code. Yeah, so that's pretty nice. And the cool thing here is that this is not something that's like hard-coded into the editor. It's something that could be just switched out for anything else. So it was sort of arbitrary that I picked this particular module to use for this formatting function. So it could really be anything. And it could do a lot more stuff as well. Like you could have it so that you could select a certain region of text in the source file and only format that. Or maybe you could have options about what kind of formatting you want, sort of like how I think ReSharper does, where you can sort of tell it how you like to format your code. So this is like the basis for like a pretty cool code formatting extension model for VS Code or any editor. So
I'm irritated by the wrong colors. PowerShell ISE are using other colors.
yeah, well the highlighting in general in VS Code uses a different model altogether. So the ISE's model is that it actually uses the tokens from the parser, and we can't use that because this is in JavaScript. So well, I guess if they gave me a model to do dynamic tokenizing, it could work. But this is basically just a regular expression-based model, and it definitely colorizes things wrong in some cases. So it's just something we have to work through. But the funny thing is that VS Code and Sublime Text and Atom all use the same syntax definition for syntax highlighting. So basically, all of those editors have these same problems, and we're going to try to like centralize work on that syntax definition so we can fix them and actually make them really good for all those editors. Well, as good as possible. I mean, when you're using regexes, you can't be perfect. So let's see. So that's cool that we can actually make a module that does this. But what if you want to? So if a user installs this module, obviously they're going to want to put it in their profile or something because they want to have this functionality available whenever they open their editor. So I'm actually going to use PS Edit to open my profile, which is interesting because there's two new things here. One is that I've brought PS Edit over from the ISE, so now you have this actually available in VS Code and any other editor that uses editor services. And the other is that we actually support profiles, or will support profiles, in the next version of the PowerShell extension for VS Code. So if I actually run this, it'll pop open my profile file, which is Microsoft.vscode_profile, and the expected path. This is the current user, current host profile. So I'll just go ahead and put the import module here, and then I'll restart VS Code really quickly. And at this point, this session is completely restarted. Excuse me. But you can see that the command has actually been registered now. So if I go back to that same format me file, look for my additional commands, I'll see that the format PowerShell script command is there, and then I can just run it the same way. So this is generally the model for, thank you. This is generally the model for how I see people shipping editor extensions, is you basically just write some useful code that might be useful inside of or outside of an editor, and you add a little bit of extra code excuse me, at the very end of your module that allows you to register those commands in the editor, and then the user just downloads your module from the PowerShell gallery and adds it to their profile, and it shows right up. One thing that I'm thinking about, which may or may not be desirable behavior, I would definitely like to get feedback, is the PowerShell gallery gives us this nice tags functionality where a module author can tag their module with just an arbitrary word or words. If we have a conventional tag for modules containing editor commands, what I could do is when one of these editors starts up, I can use the get installed modules commandlet to look for any modules that are installed on the machine that contain an editor command based on the editor command tag, and then automatically load them so that the user doesn't actually have to go into their profile and individually add every extension. So this can make it really easy for users to sort of discover and install modules without having to go to extra effort to install these things. But generally, you don't necessarily want to cause code to be loaded automatically on a user's machine, so this needs to be opt-in somehow. So maybe there's like some commandlet I can use to let the user opt in to having this automatic module loading performed in their profile. I don't know if that sounds interesting, but definitely thinking about it, so it'd be good to have any feedback there. Yeah.
I didn't get the beginning. So you want to have a second location where you put the modules and then they're auto-loaded?
No, it's modules that have been installed. So Tobias asked, if there's going to be like a second location where the modules get installed. But this is for modules that are installed from the PowerShell gallery. So anything that's in your current user module path or your local system module path. So it's just the existing module structure. We're just using the extra metadata from the PowerShell gallery about the tags that a module has to identify the ones that may have editor extensions that we can automatically find them and then load them up.
Because one logic could be placed into the PowerShell startup script that you just showed. If you had a command that gives me enough control over which things I want to load, you could put in the default thing, and you can delete it if you don't like it.
Yep.
You can adjust it to only load certain things.
Yeah, definitely. If we have a command that allows you to opt into this, then we could allow you to blacklist certain modules or whitelist certain modules or do anything. So it would give the user some level of control about what happens in this process. So that's definitely a good point. So any other questions at this point before I move further? All right, so in the session abstract, I mentioned that I'm going to be showing how to extend multiple editors using the same code. And I mentioned that I was going to be showing the PowerShell ISE Preview using the same module extension. That turned out to be a lot more difficult than it seemed. So instead, I'm going to show you a different editor. So some of you may have seen Sublime Text before. So I'm going to pop that open real quick. And you can see I've already got the code loaded up here with the same invoke format file command. So I can go in and select all this code. Just basically do the same thing here. I run the run selection command. And this actually, I've actually got this wired up to have a PowerShell session inside of Sublime Text. So you can see that it actually ran the code here. And now that the command's registered, I should be able to go into this format me file and then do the same thing, show additional commands, and then run format PowerShell script, and it does the same thing. So same code. Thank you. Same exact code file, same model, basically. It all worked in two different editors. So that's pretty cool. And it's also interesting that the integration with Sublime Text is actually starting to come along now. I've understood how Sublime's weird extensibility model works well enough to make some progress there. So that's a positive thing.
Can you quickly just describe how you're getting from Sublime to PowerShell? I was looking.
Yes, I can do that. So how does it work? So the editor, an extension for an editor that wants to bring PowerShell functionality, better PowerShell functionality, is going to have to launch the PowerShell editor services host process. And what this host process does is provides a communication model between the editor and the host, because editors like Sublime Text, they use Python. They can't run .NET code. So you have to have some way to interact with the process that's interacting with PowerShell and it can run .NET, et cetera. So what Sublime is doing in this case, and also what VS Code is doing, is they're launching this process and communicating with it over standard in, standard out. So it's writing JSON-based messages into the standard in of the host process, and the host is also writing messages on its standard out. And that's how they communicate back and forth. So in this case, the extension API calls are translated into JSON messages. So basically, each editor is going to have native implementations of this sort of message handling system so that they can respond to the requests for the different types of APIs that are provided by the extensibility model. So for Visual Studio Code, that means that there's a TypeScript implementation. For Sublime Text, there's a Python implementation, and ultimately for the PowerShell ISE, there will be a C# implementation. And for any other editor, basically, you're going to be writing a binding to these APIs using their native extension language. And basically what we're doing is just mapping common editor concepts to the actual specific editor APIs. So for VS Code, I'm digging into their own APIs and like calling open file or insert text and stuff like that. So those APIs aren't necessarily named the same thing, but I'm using sort of like a conceptual design to map like a more common API shape to their specific APIs.
So the IntelliSense is editor thing and not focused here.
Actually, this is how we get IntelliSense in Visual Studio Code. So if you actually go in and type get process, all this IntelliSense is actually coming from PowerShell through this this host process connection, and you get information about the param sets.
Sublime has no PowerShell host.
Yeah, actually.
Sublime must do the IntelliSense thing.
No, actually, it will work in Sublime Text once I get it done wiring it up. It uses the same pattern where you have an extension written in Python that's calling Sublime Text APIs, and then like whenever the user's typing, the extension will call the host to say, "Give me IntelliSense suggestions at this location," and then those get sent back and then sent to Sublime Text IntelliSense API, whatever that is, and then they get displayed. So you still get the actual IntelliSense from the PowerShell runtime in Sublime Text or any other editor. Yeah.
It's a microservice architecture, so you have a separate language service process.
Yeah.
And an IDC between the editor and the language service. So it doesn't matter that PowerShell is not embedded in
Right.
Sublime Text. As long as you have stuff in Sublime that can talk to this language service, it all works.
Exactly. And another interesting thing on that line is we also have a debugging service that does a similar thing for Visual Studio Code. So if you try to run a script in the debugger in Visual Studio Code, it's actually launching another host process which can execute the script to be debugged, and also it responds to breakpoint set requests from the editor, and then actually turns that into actual breakpoints in PowerShell, and then whenever the script stops on a breakpoint, it sends that information back to the editor so the editor can display all these nice things like the local variables and the call stack, and also the interactive console. So this model actually works pretty well. I mean, it's used pretty successfully by another project called OmniSharp, which does a very similar thing for C#. So this is used for VS Code and for Emacs and Vim and pretty much any editor you can think of to provide like real C# editing support in all these editors. So I'm basically just ripping off that model and using it here. So.
Do you think there will be some kind of capability query?
Yep. So the question is whether there'll be a capability query. There's a couple ways to approach that. At least for the Extensibility API, I was thinking that there'd probably be some object that might expose, like Booleans about whether certain things are capable, or whether it's capable, whether the specific editor has implementations for parts of the API. The alternative is just to throw like not implemented exception, but I don't really know which one is better for that. I think probably the extension code from PowerShell would want to know beforehand before trying to invoke such a method, rather than trying to use try catch everywhere. So I haven't really had clear thoughts on that yet about which one is better or if they both should be there. So, but it's a great question though. We're going to need something like that. Let's see. Any other questions about how this stuff works in general? Cool. And one last thing that I didn't really get to show today, but what my thinking is for editor-specific APIs would be that for an editor like VS Code, it has its whole API set, and it would be cool if we could provide APIs through PowerShell that sort of mimic their API shapes, not exactly, but maybe mostly, so that you can go look at VS Code's actual API documentation and sort of replicate that code in PowerShell. Obviously, we need to have an object in PowerShell that exposes these APIs, so there would have to be some C# code written to expose these objects. Potentially, there could be PowerShell code written to expose the objects too, but I haven't really thought that through yet. But there would have to be some DLL that gets loaded up into the host process to be able to provide this API contract from PowerShell that can get wrapped into JSON messages that get sent to the editor, and then the specific editor would need to have the handling on their side to interpret those messages and turn them into the actual API calls. So I think that this is going to be a pretty decent model for allowing some extra functionality for a specific editor if you care more about VS Code than Sublime Text or something. And the way that I'm thinking about doing this is in the PS editor object, you may have something like VS Code, and then you sort of get into their APIs from there. If there's a better way to do it, I'm sure Bruce can probably tell me, but that seems to be the way to do it for now. I'm also thinking about adding, in the case of the ISE, an ISE object, which will sort of be like what we have now for the $PS ISE object, but maybe a bit of a better design that is sort of more easy to evolve for the future. And maybe I can just use that to let the old PS ISE object stay the same way it is currently and not change it, and then sort of evolve some new ideas into the new extensibility model once we get the editor services integration going in PowerShell ISE Preview. So I think this could be the beginning of some interesting improvements to the ISE's extensibility model as well. And plus, it'd be nice to just to have extensions for multiple editors working so that the ISE could benefit from things done for other editors and vice versa. So the next thing is how you can help. Really, the best thing to do is to give feedback on the initial APIs. If things look weird, or if they don't make sense, or if maybe they could be easier to use somehow. It would be great to get feedback on the APIs. Also, it would be great for people to try writing and shipping extensions. Shouldn't be very hard, but at first it might be more difficult to come up with ideas for what could be cool to do. But I'm sure there's some people out there who have some thoughts already. And I really want to help anybody who has an idea. So if you are sort of inspired to do something, just tweet at me or find me somehow on GitHub or whatever. I mean, like write an issue. I mean, Twitter is really the best way to get to me. So just contact me and I'll definitely help, because I want to actually encourage people to use these things. I may actually try to have another hackathon later this year after the API stabilize a little bit, so we can maybe jumpstart the extension ecosystem a little bit. Next question would be, when will this be available? So I think I'll have a first draft in the next PowerShell for VS Code release, which is 0.6, and that's supposed to be coming the first week of May, if I can manage to get over the jet lag and get it finished. But if it turns out that I get feedback that sort of encourages me to wait another release to do it, I might wait a little bit. I want to make sure that there's not going to be huge churn between the first little release, because I want people to actually try it and not get burned if they ship an extension and then things change a lot. So I want to make sure that what I ship the first time is pretty good, so that only minor changes may happen going forward. So Sublime Text integration, I sort of see this happening in like the second quarter of 2016, maybe the third quarter of 2016. I've made enough progress now on the integration where I think that getting IntelliSense working is pretty reasonable. It shouldn't take much more effort, and that really is like the number one thing you would need to have just like an initial extension release for Sublime Text. Obviously, your REPL would be nice to have too, and I think it's a lot more possible to make that happen in Sublime Text than VS Code currently. So that might be something that comes out with the first release for that. So I think there's some people that are more of a fan of Sublime Text than VS Code, so hopefully I'll make some folks happy with that. For the PowerShell ISE Preview, I think this is going to happen later this year, because there's a lot of integration work that needs to happen and a lot of refactoring of the ISE code base to be able to use the PowerShell Editor Services core. So that may come a little bit later, but I think that that'll be a nice evolution of the ISE to be able to have like a more stable core that is shared elsewhere, so that they all can benefit from having the same features. All of the editors can. And it'll show up in other editors as they start to integrate editor services, but it's likely that these won't come online until next year. I mean, maybe Emacs happens sooner, because I'm sort of an Emacs fan, and I think that Jason Shirk's a Vim fan, so that he might help a little bit on that. So these things may happen, but I can't really make any promises, because there's just so much work to do. So now it's just time for questions and discussion. I mean, does anybody have any thoughts? Like, anybody have any ideas for something that might be cool to do with this? Does it seem stupid, crazy? Yep.
So more a general question. If I see this, what's the future for ISE? Because I think eventually you will have VS Code.
So the question is, what's the future for the ISE if VS Code continues to get better? Well, some people really only care about writing PowerShell code, and I think that for them, the ISE currently is the standard experience for doing PowerShell development, and there's no reason why it should just disappear. There's no reason why we shouldn't continue to put effort into it. And when you've got people like Tobias who have made it much more than what it is through his extension ISE Steroids, it's a viable editor that should continue to exist. So I don't see any reason why it should go away just because there's VS Code. and it's built into Windows. So it has real utility because you don't have to install something from third party or whatever.
The other thing is it's not an editor. It's a graphical console that has an editor built in.
Yeah.
It's a very different proposition.
Yeah, that's a great point. So VS Code obviously is better for people who do more than PowerShell because it has integrations for many different languages, and it's a really good editor because it has a sort of minimal interface, but it has pretty close to the same level of power as like Visual Studio. So if you're more dev focused or you do maybe some Python or Ruby development, VS Code is probably where you're going to want to work because you will also be using PowerShell for various things. But really the thing is that it's not about whether it's one or the other. It's about all of them getting to the same level because we want more people to use PowerShell. And it's hard to say, hey, you should use PowerShell if we're telling them, but you have to go use this ISE thing that doesn't have all the features you like. So it's better if we have a way to sort of meet them in the middle and give them really good PowerShell editing functionality in the editor they already use so that they are interested enough in the platform to contribute and to help build the ecosystem. So to me, the ISE is just as important as any other editor for its own